Picture this. Somewhere out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there's a country smaller than most American cities. Less than 600,000 people. No oil, no army worth mentioning. Barely any rain falls there at all. And until a few months ago, most people on this planet couldn't have pointed to it on a map. Then it walked onto the biggest stage in sports and qualified for the World Cup. Wait, how does that even happen? How does a handful of volcanic islands, scattered alone in open water, with almost nothing going for it on paper, suddenly become one of the stories everyone's talking about? That's Cape Verde. And the real question isn't where it is, it's why a place this small, this remote, this overlooked, ever mattered at all. Long before a single ball was kicked, something strange was already happening on those islands. Something that explains everything.
Here's the first thing that throws people off. When you look at Cape Verde on a map, it barely registers. A few specks of land, almost 400 miles off the coast of Senegal, floating alone in the Atlantic. You'd need to zoom in just to see it properly. But geography has never really been about size. It's about position. And almost no country on Earth proves that better than this one. For centuries, before airplanes, before the internet, before any of it, the ocean was the world's highway. Ships were how people, goods, ideas, and entire empires moved from one side of the planet to the other. And if you look at where Cape Verde sits on that highway, it's almost suspicious how perfect the location is. To the north, the routes leading toward Europe. To the south, the paths down into the Gulf of Guinea and deep into Africa. To the west, the crossings toward Brazil, the Caribbean, the Americas. To the east, the African coastline itself. Cape Verde sits right in the middle of all of it, like someone placed it there on purpose. But before any of that mattered, before a single ship ever passed by, nature had already done something extraordinary out there in the middle of the ocean. Cape Verde was born from fire. Millions of years ago, underwater volcanoes started erupting, layer after layer of lava building up beneath the surface, until slowly it broke through. 10 main islands rose out of the Atlantic, along with a handful of smaller islets. And that violent origin is still written into the landscape today. Sharp mountains, deep valleys, jagged black rock formations everywhere you look. The clearest proof is on Fogo Island. Right at its center stands an active volcano, towering nearly 9,300 feet into the sky, the highest point in the entire country. A constant reminder that Cape Verde never really stopped being connected to the forces that created it in the first place. And that's where things get strange. Because despite being born from fire, in the middle of an ocean, surrounded by water on every side, Cape Verde has spent most of its history fighting for one of the most basic resources there is: water.
Most tropical islands are green, lush, covered in rainforest, dripping with humidity. Cape Verde isn't like that. Large parts of it are dry, almost desert-like, and the reason has nothing to do with the islands themselves. It has to do with what's blowing in from across the water. The Sahara Desert sits just a few hundred miles to the east, and every single year, massive clouds of sand and dust lift off that desert and drift out over the Atlantic, right over Cape Verde. Sometimes you can watch the sky turn hazy, almost orange, as an entire desert passes silently overhead. That dust does more than color the sky. It chokes off the rain. And for an island nation with no major rivers, no large freshwater reserves, that's not a minor inconvenience. It's existential. Throughout history, droughts here haven't just been dry seasons. They've been catastrophes. Back in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, some of these droughts turned into full humanitarian crises.
Thousands of people died, not from war, not from disease alone, but from the simple absence of rain. Crops failed, wells ran dry, entire communities were left with one option: leave. So here's the contradiction sitting at the heart of this whole story. How does a country with almost nothing, no oil, no fertile farmland, not even reliable water, not just survive, but eventually thrive? The answer isn't in what Cape Verde had, it's in where Cape Verde was. When Portuguese sailors first landed on these islands around 1460, they found nobody. No indigenous population, no local kingdoms, nothing. A blank slate sitting in the middle of the ocean. And to European explorers in the middle of the Age of Discovery, a blank slate in exactly the right spot was worth more than gold. Think about what ocean travel actually looked like back then. No GPS, no weather forecasts, no way to call for help. Every voyage was a gamble against storms, against running out of food, against simply getting lost. In that world, having a reliable point to stop, resupply, and regroup in the middle of the Atlantic wasn't just useful. It could be the difference between a ship making it home or vanishing without a trace. And Cape Verde was sitting in exactly the right place to become that point. Ships leaving Europe bound for Africa would pass right by. Ships preparing for the long crossing toward the Americas would stop here first.
Almost overnight, this empty volcanic archipelago turned into something else entirely, a bridge between continents. That's how Ribeira Grande was born. Today it's called Cidade Velha, sitting on the island of Santiago, and it's now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But back then, it was one of the very first European cities ever built in the tropics. For generations, it was one of the busiest, most important ports anywhere in the Atlantic world. Sailors, traders, explorers, information, all of it flowed through that harbor constantly. But growth like that rarely comes without a cost. And what came next is one of the darkest chapters, not just in Cape Verde's story, but in world history.
Cape Verde's perfect location didn't just make it a stopover for sailors and traders. It made it a critical hinge point in the transatlantic slave trade. For centuries, this archipelago sat directly inside the route that carried millions of enslaved Africans across the ocean to the Americas. Ships used these islands to resupply, to regroup, to continue the crossing. The same geography that made Cape Verde valuable also made it complicit in one of history's greatest tragedies. And here's the part that's easy to miss. The islands themselves never produced much of anything. No major exports, no valuable crops, no minerals worth fighting over. What made Cape Verde matter wasn't what came out of the ground. It was simply where the ground happened to be. The islands sat at the center of the maritime routes that were redrawing the entire modern world, and that position alone was enough to make them indispensable. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, sailing ships gave way to steam, and Cape Verde just kept being useful. During the age of steamships, it became a refueling stop. Later, as telecommunications expanded across the globe, its location made it a natural point for laying transatlantic cables. Even well into the 20th century, with satellites and airplanes reshaping how the world connected, this small cluster of islands kept finding new reasons to matter. Think about that for a second. Different technology, different century, different empires entirely, and somehow the same 8 or 9 islands kept ending up right in the middle of whatever connected the world at that moment. That's not luck repeating itself over and over. That's geography refusing to become irrelevant. But Cape Verde's story was never just about ships passing through and routes on a map. Centuries of contact between African and European peoples on these islands created something new, a culture that didn't exist anywhere else. A distinct language, Cape Verdean Creole, spoken by nearly the entire population today. A cuisine shaped by both continents. Music that would eventually reach the entire world. Morna, the soulful, melancholic sound that found its global voice through Cesaria Évora. The singer they called the Barefoot Diva, who carried Cape Verde's culture onto stages most people from these islands could never have imagined reaching. And then there's the part of this story that might matter more than anything else. The people who left. For generations, Cape Verdeans emigrated in huge numbers, chasing opportunities the islands themselves often couldn't offer. Today, there are entire Cape Verdean communities in Portugal, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Italy, the United States. And here's the number that should stop you for a second. There are more people of Cape Verdean descent living outside the country than inside it. Let that sink in. A nation whose population, scattered across the globe, outnumbers the people actually living on its own soil. That's not a footnote. That's the key to understanding everything that happens next. including how decades later, a tiny island nation would somehow field a football team good enough to shock the entire world.
When independence finally came in 1975, after more than 5 centuries of Portuguese rule, Cape Verde was handed a brutal starting hand. Almost no natural resources, a population still recovering from generations of drought and immigration, an economy dependent on imports for almost everything. By any reasonable measure, this country should have struggled the way so many newly independent nations did in that era, and for a while it looked like it might. But something different happened here. While other countries across the region were pulled into civil wars, military coups, decades of political chaos, Cape Verde took a quieter path. It built institutions that actually held together. It invested in education year after year, even when resources were scarce. It strengthened a democracy that had no real precedent to follow. And slowly, that patience paid off. Today, Cape Verde stands as one of the most stable democracies on the entire African continent.
And one of the highest ranked nations in the region for human development, not because it got lucky with oil or diamonds or some hidden resource nobody knew about, because it built something slower and harder to destroy: trust, institutions, and a government people actually believed in. That stability opened the door to something else: tourism. Islands like Sal and Boa Vista, once barely known outside the region, started drawing travelers from across Europe, pulled in by clear water, pale sand beaches, and a climate that barely changes. Tourism is now one of the country's biggest sources of income, but even here, geography refuses to let go of the steering wheel, because almost everything on these islands has to be shipped in. Food, fuel, building materials, nearly all of it arrives by boat or plane, which means costs stay high and the economy stays exposed to whatever happens in the rest of the world. A storm in global shipping, a spike in fuel prices thousands of miles away, Cape Verde feels it almost immediately.
And there's a detail about this country that almost nobody talks about. Yes, the land itself is small, but Cape Verde's exclusive economic zone, the ocean territory it legally controls, is enormous. Hundreds of thousands of square miles of Atlantic Ocean technically belong to this nation. Fishing rights, maritime security, underwater cables, shipping lanes, all of it falls inside Cape Verde's reach. So here's the real picture: a country with barely any land, quietly controlling one of the largest stretches of ocean territory in the region. The same pattern that built this nation 500 years ago. Small territory, enormous position, is still playing out today, just with satellites and shipping containers instead of sailing ships. Which brings us to the moment that finally put all of this in front of the entire world. Not a trade route, not a treaty, not a UNESCO site. A football match. For decades, the Cape Verdean national team was a footnote. A small federation, limited resources, barely any infrastructure to develop players at home. If you'd mentioned Cape Verde to a football fan 20 years ago, most wouldn't have known the team existed, let alone where to find it in a standings table. But remember that detail from earlier? The one about more Cape Verdeans living outside the country than inside it? That diaspora didn't just send money home. It quietly built a football team. Second and third generation Cape Verdeans, born and raised in Portugal and France and the Netherlands, came up inside some of the most competitive youth academies in Europe. Real structure, real coaching, real competition week after week against some of the best young talent on the continent. Players who, on paper, qualified to play for European nations, but who chose instead to represent the islands their families came from. That choice changed everything. One by one, these players started pulling on the Cape Verdean shirt, and the team that resulted from it didn't look like a small island nation squad anymore. It looked like a side that belonged on a bigger stage entirely. Defenders who'd cut their teeth in European top flights, midfielders with real tactical discipline, and in goal, a name that would soon become inseparable from this entire story: Vozinha. Game by game, Cape Verde stopped being an easy fixture. They started holding their own against teams with far bigger populations, far bigger budgets, far bigger football histories. And then, finally, came the moment nobody saw coming: qualification. Cape Verde's first ever World Cup. Stop and actually sit with that for a second. A country with fewer people than a mid-sized city, no real football infrastructure to speak of for most of its history. A team built in large part by players raised thousands of miles from home on the world's biggest stage, alongside nations with 100 times the population and resources. For a moment, the entire planet asked the same question all at once. Where is Cape Verde exactly? And that question, that's the whole story right there. Because the answer was never really about location. It was about everything that location had built, quietly, for over 500 years.
If you've made it this far with me, do me a favor, hit subscribe and come back every day because stories like this one are exactly what this channel is built around. And here's something I want to ask you directly. Cape Verde proved that you don't need size, you don't need resources, you don't need any of the traditional advantages to matter on the world stage. So tell me in the comments, what's another country you think the world is sleeping on? One that nobody's talking about yet, but probably should be? Drop it below. I read every one. Now back to the islands, because the World Cup wasn't just a milestone for Cape Verde. It was a kind of revenge against 500 years of being overlooked. Think about every single thing this country had been, quietly, for centuries. A waypoint nobody noticed unless they needed it. A refueling stop, a cable junction. A name sailors knew, but the rest of the world didn't. Important, constantly, but never visible. Useful, but never seen. And then, for 90 minutes at a time, on screens in nearly every country on Earth, that changed completely. Television broadcasts pulled up maps of the tournament, and there it was. Cape Verde, sitting right where it always had been, in the middle of the Atlantic. Except now, millions of people were actually looking. Commentators had to explain on air where this country even was. Fans pulled out their phones mid-match to search it. For the first time in the nation's entire history, people weren't passing by Cape Verde on their way to somewhere else. They were looking directly at it. And Vozinha became the face of that moment. Not just a goalkeeper making saves, a symbol. Every dive, every clean sheet was being watched by a nation of fewer than 600,000 people back home.
And by an entire diaspora scattered across Europe and the Americas, all tuning in at once, all watching one of their own hold the line on the biggest stage in sports. For 90 minutes, the smallest country in the tournament had the loudest, most far-reaching audience in its history. People in Lisbon, people in Rotterdam, people in Boston, all watching the same flag, all holding their breath at the same time. That's the part that's easy to miss if you only see the final score. This wasn't just about football. It was about a 500-year-old pattern finally completing itself. A nation built on connection, on position, on being the bridge between places, finally getting connected to the entire world at once. Not through trade routes or telecom cables this time, but through a ball, 11 players, and a goalkeeper who refused to let the moment slip away.
So here's the thing about Cape Verde that took 500 years to fully reveal itself. It was never really hiding. It was just waiting for the right moment to be seen. Every piece of this story, the volcanoes, the drought, the empty islands the Portuguese stumbled onto by accident, the slave ships, the cables, the diaspora scattered across 3 continents, none of it was random. It was all the same pattern, repeating itself across centuries in different forms. A small piece of land in exactly the right place, finding a way to matter anyway. And maybe that's the part of this story that actually applies beyond football, beyond geography. Because most of us go through life believing we need to be the biggest, the loudest, the most resourced to matter to anyone.
Cape Verde never had any of that. What it had was position. It understood exactly where it stood, and it made itself impossible to ignore from there. Vozinha, standing in that goal, wasn't just protecting a scoreline. He was standing on 5 centuries of people who never got to be seen, finally being seen. A volcano that's still active somewhere out in that ocean, still reminding everyone on those islands where they came from. A diaspora spread across a dozen countries, still sending pieces of home back to a place most of them have never even lived. A small archipelago that the world spent 500 years sailing past.
Until, for 90 minutes, the entire world finally stopped to look. If this story moves something in you, share it with 3 people who'd appreciate it too. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. There's a lot more of this coming. And before you go, leave an honest comment. What's one country, one team, one story
you think the world hasn't discovered yet? Tell me, and maybe it becomes the next video on this channel. Cape Verde found the world by simply refusing to disappear. Maybe that's worth remembering, wherever you're standing to.